Welcome to Quiet Story Nights, a place where history whispers and stories gently carry you into sleep. Get comfortable, relax, and let tonight's story begin. Tonight, we are going to a city, the most famous city in the ancient world. The city that every other city in the ancient world measured itself against. The city of hanging gardens and towering gates and temples so grand that travellers who saw them could not find words adequate to describe what they had witnessed. Babylon. The very name carries weight, even now. For 1,000 years after the city reached its height, Babylon, the word itself sounds like something ancient, something enormous, something that was here long before us and will be remembered long after. But tonight, we are not going to Babylon at the height of its glory. We are going to a specific moment, a moment that shook the ancient world to its foundations. A moment so extreme, so violent, so charged with the accumulated fury of one man, that historians have argued about it ever since. We are going to the year 689 BC, and we are going to witness the most devastating act of deliberate destruction in the history of the ancient Near East. The king of Assyria, the most powerful man in the world, stood before the greatest city on earth, and he made a decision that every person who heard about it, in every city from Egypt to Persia, understood to be something beyond ordinary warfare, something beyond politics or strategy or the cold calculation of imperial power, something personal. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, king of the world, king of the four quarters of the earth, as his titles proclaimed, was going to destroy Babylon, not conquer it, not loot it and leave a garrison, not humble it and extract tribute, destroy it, erase it from the face of the earth so completely that even the gods who lived there would have nowhere to return to. Tonight, we find out why. Breathe slowly. Let the ancient world find you, warm and distant and endlessly strange. And let me take you back 27 centuries to the banks of the Euphrates River, to a city that believed it was eternal, and to the man who decided to prove it wrong. The world of the ancient Near East, the land between the rivers. Let me take you to a landscape unlike anything in the modern world. Mesopotamia. The Greek word means the land between the rivers, and the rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowing southward from the mountains of eastern Turkey through the flat, fertile plain of what is today Iraq, eventually joining and emptying into the Persian Gulf. This is one of the oldest continuously inhabited landscapes in the world. People have been farming here for 10,000 years. The combination of rich alluvial soil deposited by millennia of river floods and the reliable water of two great rivers made this one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. From this productivity came surplus. From surplus came cities. From cities came writing and law and mathematics and astronomy and the entire complex apparatus of organized civilization. This is where civilization began, not as mythology or metaphor, as historical archaeological fact. The world's first cities rose here, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, along the lower Euphrates 5,000 and 6,000 years ago. The world's first writing emerged here, cuneiform script pressed into clay tablets. Initially for accounting, eventually for literature and law and royal propaganda. The world's first legal codes were written here. The world's first astronomical records were kept here. The world's first schools and libraries and bureaucracies were here. Mesopotamia was the engine of the ancient world. And at its heart, sitting astride the Euphrates, perhaps 90 kilometers south of the modern city of Baghdad, was the city that gave the whole civilization its symbolic center, Babylon. Babylon. The name Babylon derives from the Akkadian Bobilim, Gate of the Gods, and the city lived up to its name. It was, for most of the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, the religious and cultural capital of Mesopotamian civilization, the city where the great god Marduk resided, where the New Year festival that renewed the cosmos was celebrated, where the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of Mesopotamian civilization was housed and transmitted. Babylon was not always the largest city in Mesopotamia. It had periods of prosperity and periods of decline. It was conquered and reconquered, destroyed and rebuilt, dominated by foreign powers, and then resurging to dominance itself. The history of Babylon is the history of Mesopotamian civilization, turbulent, complex, never simple, never reducible to a single narrative. But through all of these vicissitudes, Babylon retained a unique status, a symbolic importance that went beyond politics or military power. To control Babylon was to control the legitimacy of kingship over all of Mesopotamia. To destroy Babylon was to attack not just a city but an idea, the idea of civilization itself. Every king who ruled Mesopotamia understood this. Even foreign conquerors, even the Assyrians, the Kassites, the Persians, when they took Babylon, they did not simply loot and leave. They took the hand of Marduk. They performed the rituals. They inserted themselves into the symbolic order that Babylon represented. To be king in Mesopotamia, you had to be king in Babylon, even if you were from somewhere else entirely. Even if you hated the city with every fiber of your being. Even, as we shall see, if you were Sennacherib. Assyria. Now, let me tell you about the other great power of the ancient Near East, the power that would eventually produce the man at the center of our story. Assyria. The Assyrian homeland was in the upper Tigris Valley in what is today northern Iraq. The Assyrians were Semitic people speaking a dialect of Akkadian closely related to Babylonian. They shared the same religious traditions, the same cuneiform writing system, the same basic cultural framework as the Babylonians to their south. But they were different in one crucial respect. The Assyrians built the most fearsome military machine the ancient Near East had ever seen. For centuries, from approximately 900 BC to 612 BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was the dominant power in the ancient world. At its greatest extent, it stretched from Egypt in the west to the borders of Persia in the east, from the mountains of Anatolia in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. The Assyrian army was extraordinary. Not just large, not just well-equipped, though it was superbly equipped. What made the Assyrian army uniquely terrifying was its systematic, professional approach to every aspect of warfare. Siege engineering that could breach any wall. Cavalry and chariots that could pursue a retreating enemy across any terrain. Logistics that could supply an army in the field for months. And an intelligence network that gave Assyrian kings information about their enemies, dispositions and intentions before those enemies had finished formulating their plans. The Assyrians were also, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinarily brutal in their treatment of enemies who resisted. Terre royale inscriptions carved on the walls of their palaces for all to describe in graphic, almost boastful detail the fates of cities that defied Assyrian power. Populations deported, leaders executed publicly and in ways designed for maximum psychological impact. Cities burned and salted and leveled. This was not random cruelty, it was calculated policy. Terror as a strategic weapon. The message was clear: submit and you will be treated reasonably. Resist, and what happened to the last city that resisted will happen to you. It worked for most of the Neo-Assyrian period. The sheer reputation of the Assyrian army was often sufficient to induce submission without a battle. But not always. And when it didn't work, when a city or a people chose resistance over submission, the consequences were exactly as advertised. The father and the city. To understand Sennacherib, you must understand his father. Sargon, who ruled Assyria from 722 to 705 BC, he was, by the standards of Assyrian kings, extraordinarily successful. He completed the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel, the deportation of the 10 tribes that became one of the defining events of biblical history. He defeated and deported populations from across the ancient Near East, resettling conquered peoples in new locations to prevent future revolts. He built a magnificent new capital city, Dur-Sharrukin, and moved the Assyrian administration there. And he managed Babylon. Sargon's relationship with Babylon was the central problem of his reign, as it would be of his sons. Babylon was too important, too symbolically crucial, to simply ignore or destroy. But it was also too proud, too wealthy, too connected to its own traditions and the neighboring powers who valued those traditions to be easily controlled. For most of his reign, Sargon tried to rule Babylon through accommodation, performing the traditional rituals, claiming the title of King of Babylon alongside his Assyrian titles, presenting himself as a legitimate successor to the Babylonian tradition. But Babylon kept rebelling, kept allying itself with Assyria's enemies, particularly with Elam, the powerful kingdom to the east in what is today southwestern Iran, kept exploiting every moment of Assyrian weakness or distraction to assert its independence. In 710 BC, Sargon finally took direct control of Babylon, expelling the Chaldean tribal leader, Marduk-apli-iddina, known in the Bible as Merodach-Baladan, who had been ruling the city with Elamite support. Sargon entered Babylon in triumph, performed the New Year ritual, took the hand of Marduk, and declared himself legitimate king. But he never really solved the Babylonian problem. He simply suppressed it temporarily. And then, in 705 BC, Sargon died. He died in battle against a minor northern people in circumstances that were deeply, profoundly shocking to the Assyrian world. Not just that a great king had died, though that was significant, but that his body was not recovered. It was left on the battlefield. It was never given proper burial. In the ancient Near East, this was a catastrophe of the highest order. A king whose body was not properly buried could not be properly mourned, could not receive the funerary rites that were necessary for his peaceful transition to the afterlife. His spirit would wander. He would not rest. Why had this happened? What had Sargon done to deserve such a fate? The theologians and diviners of Assyria spent years trying to answer that question. And the answer they eventually settled on haunted his son for the rest of his life. Sargon had not been sufficiently respectful of Babylon and its gods. The unquiet spirit of Sargon, too, wandering the spaces between the living and the dead because his body was never found, was a warning. A warning that his son Sennacherib took very seriously and interpreted in a completely unexpected way. Sennacherib, a new king. Sennacherib came to the throne of Assyria in 705 BC in the immediate aftermath of his father's shocking death. He was not young, probably in his late 30s or early 40s when he became king. He had served as crown prince for years, governing the Assyrian heartland, while his father campaigned, learning the administration of the empire firsthand. He was experienced, capable, and possessed of a formidable intelligence. He was also, by every indication of the historical record, a man of exceptional willpower and exceptional pride. The kind of man who, once he had decided on a course of action, pursued it with a relentlessness that brooked no obstacle and accepted no compromise. His first years as king were consumed by the problems his father had left him. The empire was restless. Subject peoples who had been waiting for the transition between kings, always the most vulnerable moment for any ancient empire, were testing their limits. In Sevest, Hezekiah of Judah was fortifying Jerusalem and organizing a coalition of Levantine states. In the south, Merodach-Baladan had returned to Babylon and reclaimed the throne with Elamite support. Sennacherib dealt with both problems systematically. In 701 BC, a massive campaign westward, sweeping through the Levant, devastating Judah, surrounding Jerusalem, exacting tribute. The biblical account in the Book of Kings and the Assyrian account in Sennacherib's own annals diverge dramatically. In their conclusions, the Bible describes a miraculous deliverance. The Assyrian account claims a successful campaign and tribute, but both agree that Sennacherib was there and that he was formidable. But it was Babylon that consumed him, Babylon that he could not let go of, Babylon that became the obsession of his reign. The Babylonian problem? Merodach-Baladan, the Chaldean king who kept returning to Babylon like a bad dream, was finally expelled for good around 703 BC, but the Babylonian problem did not end with him. It never ended. That was the nature of the Babylonian problem. Sennacherib tried, different approaches. He tried ruling Babylon directly. He tried appointing a son as viceroy. He tried co-opting Babylonian elites. He tried everything his father had tried and watched it produce the same result. Revolt, alliance with Elam, armed resistance. The cycle repeating. The final revolt began around 703 BC and lasted, with interruptions and complications until the catastrophic end in 689 BC during Sis. Period. Babylon allied with Elam multiple times, sought support from the Chaldean tribes of southern Mesopotamia, and even, in a move that deeply shocked the Assyrian world, made overtures to Egypt. The most significant single event of this long conflict came in 691 BC, at the Battle of Halul, on the Tigris River. A coalition of Babylonian and Elamite and Chaldean and other forces met Sennacherib's army in what was, by the standards of the ancient world, an enormous battle. The outcome is disputed. Sennacherib's annals claim a great Assyrian victory, but the aftermath suggests that the battle was at best inconclusive. The Babylonian resistance continued. The Elamite alliance held, and Sennacherib did not immediately follow up with a decisive campaign. Something happened at Halul that frustrated the Assyrian king deeply. Perhaps he had expected a quick victory and been denied it. Perhaps he had sustained losses that his propaganda could not entirely conceal. Perhaps it was at Halul that whatever remaining patience Sennacherib had with the Babylonian problem finally ran out. Because what he did next was utterly without precedent in Mesopotamian history. Decision. Let your breathing slow. The night is long and quiet. What we are approaching is not a comfortable story, but it is a true one, and truth has its own kind of comfort in the dark. In 689 BC, the years of war and revolt and frustration, Sennacherib made his decision. He was going to destroy Babylon, not punish it. Not install a more reliable governor and hope for a better outcome. Destroy it. Completely, systematically, deliberately. In a way that made absolutely clear that this was not a military action or a political calculation, but something else entirely. All statement. The ancient sources, Sennacherib's own inscriptions, which he carved on the walls of his palace in Nineveh for all to see and for posterity to remember, describe his reasoning in terms that are remarkable for their honesty. He was not pretending this was a normal military operation. He was acknowledging that what he was doing was extraordinary, that it required explanation. That even he understood that destroying Babylon was something that needed to be justified to the gods and to history. His justification was theological, legal, and deeply personal. Theologically, he argued that the Babylonians had repeatedly violated their oaths to the Assyrian king, oaths sworn before the gods, and that the gods had therefore abandoned Babylon and approved its destruction. Legally, he argued that Babylon had forfeited its rights and its protection by its continuous rebellions. And personally, though this was not stated explicitly in the inscriptions, there was the memory of his father's unburied body. The accusation that Sargon had been punished by the gods for his insufficient respect for Babylon. If the gods had punished his father for being too deferential to Babylon, Sennacherib would not make the same mistake. He would be the instrument of the gods' judgment. He would prove that Babylon's gods had abandoned it by destroying everything they had supposedly protected. The decision was made. The army marched south. The siege of Babylon in 689 BC was not a long one by ancient standards. The city's defences, substantial, designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault, held for a period, but not indefinitely against the full force of the Assyrian military machine. Babylon fell, and then Sennacherib began. His inscriptions describe what followed in extraordinary detail. He clearly wanted it remembered. He wanted every detail recorded and transmitted to every corner of the empire and to every future generation. The destruction of Babylon was not something to be hidden or minimized. It was to be proclaimed. The city was looted first. The temples and Babylon had many. The accumulated sacred wealth of centuries were stripped. The great temple of Marduk, the Esagila, was plundered of everything movable. Gold and silver and bronze and precious stones and fine textiles and cult statues, the gods of Babylon, which the Assyrians treated as real beings who could be captured and deported, were taken. The cult statue of Marduk himself, the central sacred object of Babylonian religion, the physical embodiment of the god who was the divine king of the gods, was taken. Carried away to Assyria, this was a devastating act of symbolic violence. Without Marduk's statue, the New Year festival could not be performed. Without the New Year festival, the cosmos could not be renewed. Without the renewal of the cosmos, the world itself was in danger. Sennacherib was not just attacking a city. He was attacking the religious foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. And he was just beginning. The destruction, fire and water. After the looting came the destruction. Sennacherib's inscriptions describe the process with a systematic thoroughness. That is chilling precisely because of its orderliness. This was not the random violence of an army let loose in a conquered city. It was methodical, planned, each stage deliberately executed. The palaces were destroyed. The great mud brick and fired brick structures that housed the Babylonian royalty and aristocracy, buildings that had accumulated over centuries, layer upon layer of construction and reconstruction, were demolished. Their materials scattered. The temples were destroyed, not just stripped of their valuables that had already been done, but physically demolished. The great ziggurat Etemenanke, possibly the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel. A massive stepped temple tower that rose perhaps 90 meters above the flat plain of Babylonia, was attacked. The walls of the city were demolished. The massive defensive walls of Babylon, wide enough, according to later ancient accounts, for a chariot to turn around on top, were torn down. The houses of the city were burned. The fires spread. Wood and reed and textile and the accumulated domestic possessions of a great city's population fed the flames. The smoke rose, visible for miles across the flat plain, And this was the act that made what Sennacherib did unique. The act that had no precedent in the history of the ancient Near East, he diverted the Euphrates. He opened canals. He changed the course of the river. He flooded what remained of the city with water. Water, in Mesopotamian cosmological thought, was the primordial substance, the abyss, the watery deep from which creation had emerged. To flood a city was not merely to wet it. It was to return it to the state of pre-creation, to unmake it, to dissolve it back into the chaos that existed before the gods had shaped it into an ordered world. Sennacherib knew exactly what he was doing. He was not just destroying a city, he was performing a reverse creation. He was symbolically returning Babylon to the nothing from which it had come. And in his inscription, he made the symbolism explicit. He wrote that he had made the site of Babylon as flat as a meadow, that he had destroyed it more completely than a flood, that he had taken the soil of its temples and thrown it into the Euphrates to be carried down to the sea. The soil of the temples, carried to the sea. He was erasing Babylon from the landscape as if it had never been. The theological justification. Now here is where the story becomes even more extraordinary. Because Sennacherib was not a man who acted without justification, or rather, without the need to provide justification. He was a king of a literate civilization with sophisticated theological traditions, and what he had done required explanation. His scribes produced an extraordinary document, a theological treatise, in essence, arguing that the destruction of Babylon had been not just permitted but required by the gods. The argument ran something like this. Marduk, the great god of Babylon, had become angry with his own city. The Babylonians had sinned against divine order through their repeated rebellions, their violations of sacred oaths, their alliance with Elam, which the Assyrian theological tradition considered a land of chaos and disorder. Marduk had therefore decided to punish his own people. He had selected Sennacherib as his instrument of punishment. In other words, Sennacherib had not defied Marduk by destroying Babylon. He had served Marduk. He had been the god's chosen agent of righteous destruction. This was a remarkable piece of theological innovation. To take the destruction of the greatest temple of Marduk in the world and frame it as an act. Performed in Marduk's service, this required considerable intellectual audacity. But there was more. The scribes also produced a version of events in which the Assyrian god Ashur had absorbed or become identified with Marduk. The theological restructuring of the divine order to match the political reality on the ground. If Assyria had conquered Babylon, then Ashur had conquered Marduk, or rather, Ashur and Marduk were revealed to be aspects of the same divine power, with Ashur as the supreme expression. The political triumph of Assyria over Babylon was being rewritten as a theological truth. The Babylonian religious tradition was being absorbed into the Assyrian one, with Assyria inevitably on top. It was, intellectually, a breathtaking performance. And it tells us something important about Sennacherib himself. He was not simply a destroyer. He was a man who thought deeply about what he was doing, who felt the need to justify it not just to his contemporaries but to the gods and to history. He knew what he was doing was extraordinary. He wanted posterity to understand why. The reaction. The destruction of Babylon sent shockwaves across the ancient Near East. Every city, every king, every priest and scribe and merchant from Egypt to Persia understood what it meant. The most sacred city in Mesopotamian civilization had been deliberately, systematically erased by the most powerful king in the world. The cult statue of Marduk had been taken to Assyria. The New Year festival could not be performed. The cosmic order had been disrupted in the most fundamental way imaginable. The reactions were varied and complex. Among the Assyrian ruling class, there appears to have been genuine discomfort. Not with the fact of Babylon's destruction. The Babylonians had been a persistent source of trouble and expense, but with the manner of it. The destruction of a city and the defilement of its gods went against deep assumptions about how even enemies should be treated. The gods of defeated peoples were real gods. They commanded respect even from their conquerors. To destroy their temples, to carry off their statues, to flood their sacred precincts, this was dangerous. The gods might retaliate. Outside Assyria, the reaction was simpler horror and the beginning of a determination that what had been done to Babylon would eventually be avenged. The populations of the ancient Near East did not forget easily, and the destruction of Babylon, the greatest act of cultural and religious vandalism the ancient world had yet witnessed, was precisely the kind of event that embedded itself in cultural memory for generations. It would be avenged. It would take time. But the reckoning would come. The man behind the act. Let me take you inside the mind of Sennacherib for a moment, as much as the historical record allows. What kind of man destroys Babylon? The portrait that emerges from his inscriptions and from the broader historical record is complex. He was, by any measure, an extraordinarily capable ruler. His military campaigns were brilliantly executed. His administrative reforms reorganized and strengthened the Assyrian Empire. His building projects transformed Nineveh into one of the great cities of the ancient world, the parks and palaces and canals that he constructed. There were celebrated in his own time and remembered for centuries. He was also, clearly, a man of strong emotions. The inscriptions that describe the destruction of Babylon are not the dry, administrative language of a bureaucrat recording a policy decision. They are charged, personal. You can feel, beneath the formal language of royal propaganda, something that reads like fury-controlled, purposeful fury, but fury nonetheless. What was the source of that fury? Partly, certainly, political. Babylon had been a thorn in the Assyrian side for generations. It had resisted, rebelled, allied with enemies, required repeated costly military interventions. Any king who had dealt with it as long as Sennacherib had would have been frustrated. But there was something more personal too, something that goes back to his father's unburied body. to the years of theological anxiety about why Sargon had been denied proper burial, to the suggestion, however carefully worded by the diviners, that his father's insufficiently deferential treatment of Babylon had brought divine punishment. Sennacherib had grown up with that anxiety, had inherited it, and somewhere in the calculation that led to 689 BC, that anxiety had curdled into something harder, into a refusal to be bound by Babylon's claim on Assyrian deference, into a determination to resolve the Babylonian question once and for all in the most definitive way possible. He would not be punished as his father had been. He would not be shown to have respected Babylon insufficiently. He would show that Babylon required no respect at all, that its gods were powerless, its traditions meaningless, its centuries of sacred status nothing but presumption. He would prove it by destroying it. Se'amath, the haunted king. Something happened to Sennacherib after the destruction of Babylon. We cannot see inside his mind. We do not have his private correspondence or his diary. We have his official inscriptions, which were designed for public consumption, and the archaeological evidence, and the later Babylonian and biblical accounts which were written by people who hated him. But the official record itself suggests that the years after 689 BC were not easy ones. The great theological justification that his scribes had constructed, Marduk had chosen Sennacherib. Ashur and Marduk were one. The destruction of Babylon was an act of divine will appears to have convinced some people. Perhaps even Sennacherib himself at times. But the anxiety did not entirely go away. The removal of Marduk's statue to Assyria was a statement of theological power. But it was also, potentially, a source of theological danger. A powerful god whose statue had been taken was not a neutralized god. It was an angry god. A god who might eventually find a way to express that anger. The Assyrian religious establishment was not entirely comfortable with what had been done. The traditions that required respect for the gods of conquered peoples were deep. The priests knew that what Sennacherib had done was unprecedented, and unprecedented actions in a world governed by divine will were always potentially dangerous. Sennacherib's later years show a king still active, still capable, still building and campaigning. But there is a quality of defensiveness in some of the later inscriptions. A continued need to justify, to explain, to argue that what had been done was right. As if he was trying to convince not just his subjects but himself. The assassination. In 681 after the death of Sennacherib was murdered. Murdered by his own sons. The ancient sources, Babylonian, biblical, Greek, all agree on the basic fact. 2 of his sons killed him in circumstances that suggest a palace conspiracy of some kind. The Babylonian Chronicle, which recorded events with terse precision, simply notes that Sennacherib was killed by his son. The Bible, in the 2nd book of Kings, says that his sons Adrammelech and Sharezer killed him with the sword while he was worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch, and then fled to Ararat. The question that ancient people asked, and that modern historians continue to ask, is why? The practical reasons are not hard to find. Sennacherib had complicated the succession by changing his choice of crown prince. His preferred heir, an older son named Ardimilisi, had apparently been passed over in favor of a younger son, Esarhaddon, for reasons that are not entirely clear. Ardimilisi, deprived of the succession he had expected, had motive. But ancient people, and perhaps Sennacherib himself, if he had any warning, asked a deeper question. Was his murder divine punishment? Was this the gods' response to the destruction of Babylon? The Babylonians certainly thought so. Their chronicles and literary traditions returned repeatedly to the idea that Sennacherib's fate murdered by his own sons. In his own temple, while praying to his own god, was the god's judgment on what he had done to Babylon and to Marduk. The greatest king in the world, brought low by his own family in the house of his own divinity. The punishment fit the crime with a kind of theological poetry. He had destroyed a god's house. He had been killed in a god's house. He had disrupted the sacred relationship between a king and his gods. His own son had disrupted the sacred relationship between a son and his father. What you do to others, the ancient world believed, eventually comes back to you. Esarhaddon's dilemma. Sennacherib's chosen successor, Esarhaddon, came to the throne of Assyria in 680 BC after a brief civil war against the brothers who had murdered his father. Esarhaddon was a remarkable man in his own right, perhaps the most diplomatically sophisticated of all the Assyrian kings, and the first decision of his reign established the pattern for everything that followed. He was going to rebuild Babylon. This was an extraordinary reversal. Not just politically, though it was certainly that. A signal to Babylonian populations and the wider ancient world that the new Assyrian king was taking a different approach. It was a statement about what Sennacherib had done. An implicit acknowledgement that the destruction of Babylon had been wrong, that the gods had indeed been angered, that the murder of Sennacherib was divine punishment that required expiation. Esarhaddon's inscriptions about the rebuilding of Babylon are remarkable documents. He had to explain why Babylon had been destroyed while also explaining why it was now being rebuilt. He had to acknowledge his father's act while distancing himself from it. He had to reassure Babylonian populations that the new king respected their traditions while also reassuring Assyrian hardliners that he was not abandoning his father's legacy. The theological solution was elegant. Esarhaddon argued that Marduk had indeed been angry with Babylon, his fathers. Theological justification had been correct about that. But the punishment had been intended to last only 70 years. And through a textual interpretation that is either a brilliant piece of theological creativity or a remarkable coincidence, the cuneiform signs for 70. And 11 could be confused. The scribe was able to argue that the 70 years had already passed and the time for restoration had come. Babylon had been punished. The punishment was over. It was time to rebuild. The rebuilding began under Esarhaddon and was continued by his son Assurbanipal. The temples were reconstructed. The walls were rebuilt. Marduk's statue was eventually returned from Assyria. The New Year festival was restored. Babylon rose from the destruction that Sennacherib had intended to be permanent. The long memory of Babylon. The destruction of Babylon by Sennacherib left marks on the ancient world that lasted for centuries. In Babylonian culture and literature, it became one of the defining traumas, an event that was processed and reprocessed through theological and literary frameworks for generations. The Lamentations over the destruction of Babylonian cities, a literary genre that the Mesopotamians had developed to a high art after previous catastrophes, produced new texts mourning what Sennacherib had done. The abduction of Marduk's statue and its eventual return became the subject of theological reflection on divine will and divine justice. The memory fed the ancient Near Eastern concept of divine justice. The punishment that Sennacherib had visited on Babylon was, in the Babylonian view, visited back on him and his dynasty. His murder by his own sons. The eventual fall of the Assyrian Empire itself, which came less than a century after the destruction of Babylon, when a coalition of Babylonians and Medes destroyed Nineveh in 612 BC, was seen as the final account being settled. The Assyrian Empire that Sennacherib had built and represented. The empire that had seemed as permanent and unchallengeable as the sky, it fell. Nineveh, the magnificent capital that Sennacherib had made one of the wonders of the world, was destroyed. The Assyrian state ceased to exist, and Babylon rose again under the Neo-Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar II to become the greatest city in the world. The Hanging Gardens, the Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant blue glazed bricks and its processions of lions and dragons. The most famous city in the ancient world. What Sennacherib had tried to erase had outlasted him, outlasted his empire, outlasted everything he built. The biblical connection? Sennacherib in the Bible. No account of Sennacherib is complete without the Bible. Because Sennacherib's campaign against Judah in 701 BC, his siege of Jerusalem. His dealings with King Hezekiah is one of the best documented events in ancient history, attested by both Assyrian and biblical sources. The Assyrian account, in Sennacherib's own annals, is terse and precise. He claims to have devastated 46 walled cities of Judah, deported over 200,000 people. Shut Hezekiah up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage and extracted enormous tribute. The biblical account in the second book of Kings and the book of Isaiah tells the same story very differently. Sennacherib's army surrounds Jerusalem. His general, the Rabshakeh, delivers a speech outside the walls designed to demoralize the defenders. A speech recorded in extraordinary detail in the biblical text, the most vivid piece of psychological warfare in ancient literature. Hezekiah, in desperation, consults the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah assures him that God will protect Jerusalem. And then, according to the Bible, an angel of the Lord strikes down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. Sennacherib withdraws. He returns to Nineveh, and there his sons kill him. The two accounts diverge completely on the outcome. The Assyrian account claims victory and tribute. The biblical account claims miraculous divine deliverance. What actually happened? Historians have proposed various explanations. A plague sweeping through the Assyrian camp, a rebellion elsewhere in the empire requiring Sennacherib's urgent return, a political settlement that both sides could claim as a victory. We do not know. What we know is that Jerusalem was not destroyed in 701 BC. Sennacherib did not do to Jerusalem what he later did to Babylon. Hezekiah continued to reign. The Davidic dynasty continued, and in the biblical memory, this became one of the defining moments of Israelite faith, the moment when God had protected his city from the greatest military power in the world. The memory that sustained Jerusalem through centuries of subsequent difficulty. Sennacherib, who had tried to use terror as a strategic weapon, had instead created a story of divine deliverance that would be told and retold for 3,000 years. Echoes across time. The story of Sennacherib and Babylon echoes across time in ways that its participants could not have imagined. The theological questions that his destruction of Babylon raised about the relationship between political power and divine sanction, about whether rulers can claim divine authority for their actions, about the limits of power and the reality of divine justice are questions that subsequent civilizations returned to again and again. The Persian king Cyrus, who conquered Babylon in 539 BC and issued his famous cylinder decree restoring the temples and the deported peoples of the region, was consciously positioning himself in opposition to the Sennacherib tradition. He was the anti-Sennacherib, the king who respected the gods of conquered peoples, who returned their statues, who let the deported return home, the Jewish community in Babylonian exile, who experienced Cyrus's edict as their liberation, found in it a confirmation of everything their tradition had told them about divine justice. The power that had oppressed them, the Babylonian Empire that had itself destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC, had fallen. The God of Israel had acted through an unlikely instrument, a Persian king, to restore what had been lost. The cycles of destruction and restoration, of imperial pride and imperial fall, of divine punishment and divine mercy, these cycles, which the story of Sennacherib and Babylon represents in its most vivid and concentrated form, became part of the theological vocabulary of every subsequent monotheistic tradition. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all three drew on the Mesopotamian experience of empire and exile and restoration. All three developed their understandings of divine justice partly in conversation, with the questions that events like Sennacherib's destruction of Babylon had raised. The ancient world's most dramatic act of political fury has left its traces in the religious imagination of billions of people who have never heard the name Sennacherib. What it means, the archaeology. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists excavated both Nineveh and Babylon, and what they found illuminated the story in remarkable ways. At Nineveh, the site of modern Mosul in northern Iraq, they found Sennacherib's palace. The palace without rival, as he called it. Its walls were covered with carved stone reliefs depicting his campaigns, the siege of Lachish in Judah, rendered in extraordinary detail, other military victories, the garden that Sennacherib had built around his palace, which some scholars have suggested may have been the original inspiration for the legend of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The reliefs are extraordinary documents. They show the Assyrian army in action, the siege engines, the disciplined infantry, the cavalry, with a precision and realism that makes them among the finest military art in the ancient world. They also show the fate of the conquered, the deportations, the executions of leaders, the populations being marched away from their destroyed cities. Sennacherib wanted these images seen, wanted the power of Assyria and the consequences of resistance made permanently, unmistakably visible. And in the royal library of Nineveh, the greatest library of the ancient world, collected by Sennacherib's grandson, Assurbanipal, they found the cuneiform tablets that contained the Babylonian literary tradition, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, legal texts, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, mathematical calculations. The Assyrian kings who had destroyed Babylon had also preserved its literature. The culture they had tried to erase had been absorbed into their own civilization so completely that when their own empire fell, Babylon's traditions survived in the ruins of Nineveh. At Babylon itself, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey excavated in the early 20th century and found the rebuilt city of the Neo-Babylonian period, the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar II, the Ishtar Gate, now reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, the processional way, the foundations of the great temple of Marduk. The Babylon that Sennacherib had tried to erase had been rebuilt so magnificently that it became the template for all subsequent ideas of what a great city should look like. Power and its limits. What does the story of Sennacherib and Babylon tell us? It tells us about power and its limits. Sennacherib was, by every measure, the most powerful man in the world. In 689 BC he commanded the greatest army, ruled the largest empire, sat atop the most sophisticated administrative apparatus that the ancient Near East had yet produced, and he used that power to do something unprecedented, to destroy the most sacred city in the world, to scatter its gods, to flood its temples, to attempt to erase from the face of the earth a tradition of civilization that was older than Assyria itself. He had the power to do it. He did it. And then he was murdered by his own sons, and within a century, everything he built was gone. The Assyrian Empire, the empire that had seemed, in Sennacherib's time, as permanent as the stars, was destroyed by a coalition of former subjects. Nineveh, the city that Sennacherib had made the most magnificent in the world, was so thoroughly destroyed that its location was lost for centuries. When Xenophon marched his Greek army past its ruins in 401 BC, he had no idea that the mound of earth beside the Tigris was the remains of the greatest city of the previous century. And Babylon, the city that Sennacherib had tried to erase, was rebuilt, restored, and elevated to heights of glory that made it the most famous city in the ancient world for another 6 centuries. Power has limits. The most powerful man in the world could not unmake a city that had been built on human meaning and human memory. He could destroy the physical structures. He could scatter the people. He could carry off the statues. But he could not destroy the idea. He could not make the world forget that Babylon had existed, that Marduk had been worshipped there, that the accumulated civilization of thousands of years had found its home on those banks of the Euphrates. The idea was stronger than the army. The sleep of empires. Empires sleep. They rise in fury and purpose and overwhelming power, and then they sleep and other empires rise in their place. And those sleep too, and the process continues. Assyria sleeps now. Its kings are names in history books, and its cities are mounds of earth beside the Tigris. The language they spoke, Akkadian, written in the cuneiform script that they had inherited from the Sumerians, has been silent for 2,000 years. The gods they worshipped, Ashur and Ishtar and Adad, have had no temples and no worshippers for millennia. Babylon sleeps too, in a different way. The physical city, the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, rebuilt so magnificently after Sennacherib's destruction, is a ruin in the Iraqi desert, south of modern Baghdad. The Ishtar Gate that once dazzled travelers from every corner of the ancient world is partially reconstructed in a German museum. The Euphrates still flows, but its course has shifted and the ancient harbors and canals are dry. But Babylon does not entirely sleep. It lives on in the imagination, in the biblical tradition that made it a symbol of human pride and divine judgment, in the legend of the Tower of Babel, in the hanging gardens that became one of the 7 wonders of the world, in the name itself, which carries across for 1,000 years of human language and thought a resonance that no other ancient city name quite matches. Even Sennacherib, who tried so hard to erase it, made Babylon more memorable. His destruction of it is part of why we remember it. The act of attempted erasure preserves the thing it tries to destroy. Let the ancient world settle in you now, gently, the way the silt from an ancient river settles to the bottom of still water. Layer by layer, year by year, building the land that cities are eventually built on. Sennacherib is gone. Babylon is a ruin. The Euphrates still flows, brown and patient and ancient, carrying its silt toward the Gulf, as it always has. But something of what happened there is still present in the religious traditions that wrestled with those events and found in them patterns of meaning that they passed on, in the legal and political concepts that emerged from the encounter between Assyrian power and Babylonian tradition, in the deep human understanding earned through experience paid for in catastrophe, that power has limits. That what you destroy with your hands, you cannot destroy in the mind of the world. You are lying in the long darkness of another night. The same darkness that fell over Nineveh and Babylon. The same stars that Sennacherib's scribes watched to read omens. The same moon that rose over the siege and the destruction. And the flood waters that covered what had once been the gate of the gods. The great ones sleep, their empires are dust. Their gods are names in ancient texts that scholars read in quiet rooms. And the night continues, as it always has, large and dark and full of stars. Let your breathing slow. Let the rivers carry everything downstream. Let the silt settle. Let the layers of time press down gently, one upon another, the way they have been pressing for 4,000 years over the ruins of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Sennacherib destroyed Babylon. Babylon outlasted Sennacherib. And you, warm and quiet, and breathing slowly in the darkness, you outlast this day. Sleep well. The river flows on.